Half a day, my name is Justin Kenga, and today I will be discussing the revenue dispersion ratio. So when we talk about revenue dispersion, we are looking at how heavily a government, in this case the government of Guam, relies on revenue sources that it does not control. So examples of revenue sources that GovGuam doesn't control would be things like operating grants, income taxes, and Section 30 taxes. To calculate the revenue dispersion ratio, you're going to divide the controlling revenues by the total revenues. So you kind of have to look at the government you're analyzing and figure out which of those revenue sources are actually controlled by that government. For GovGuam, that would be charges for services, the GRT taxes, as well as hotel occupancy taxes, and the other ones listed on the table in the previous slide. The benchmark for revenue dispersion is 50%, so that means that ideally governments should control at least 50% of their overall revenues. So if you see a declining ratio over the years or a ratio below 50%, that's kind of a warning that the government is going to be more prone to financial difficulties. So when we look at the government of Guam, you can see that the closest we've gotten to the ideal ratio of 50% occurred in the year 2019. We reached 40% in this year, and then you'll see that in the 2 years following, there was a sharp decline, which I will be talking about in the analysis portion of this presentation. So like I mentioned before, there was a sharp decline for the revenue dispersion ratio after the year 2019. And I think this was largely due to the fact that COVID was happening in 2020. So if you remember, in March of 2020, the governor had issued the executive order, and that ordered for the closure of GovGuam offices, and that also restricted access to the island from countries that already had confirmed cases of COVID-19. So because we weren't allowing visitors from foreign countries into Guam, naturally the tourism industry began to suffer, and the hotel occupancy went down 18.3 million from 2019 to 2020. And as I mentioned before, hotel occupancy taxes do make up a good portion of the controlled revenues for the government of Guam. And in addition to the hotel occupancy going down by so much, Guam also was the recipient of various federal grants, which included the unemployment grants, the PUA that people were getting for unemployment. And federal grants are considered non-controlling revenues. And so because of both of those events that were results of COVID-19, our controlled revenues had gone down and our overall non-controlled revenues had gone up. So naturally that would cause the dispersion to lower. Moving on to recommendations, so really the only way to increase the revenue dispersion ratio would be to increase the amount of revenues that we actually control. And as I've mentioned, one of those is the hotel occupancy taxes, and it's actually a very important one because Guam's economy is based so largely on the hotel industry. And I think that by investing in international marketing, we can attract those tourists back to Guam, because even though COVID has calmed down a little bit, we still see in the year 2020 to 2021, there was another decline in the hotel occupancy taxes. Another revenue source that the government of Guam controls is the taxes we have on tobacco. And I think that a way to increase this would be to impose those same taxes on vape products. And the last recommendation I had would be for Guam to have a reliable public transportation system, because then we could charge people for that service, and charges for services are considered to be a controlled revenue. And you'll see that in places that have very reliable and safe transportation systems, so places like Japan or Korea, people actually spend a lot of money on these services. And so that would increase the charges for services and would overall have a good effect on our controlled revenues for the government of Guam. And that concludes this presentation. Thank you for watching. This is Revenue Dispersion for BA 401 Government Accounting.